Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for being here with us today. I'm Maureen Greeley, the Executive Director of the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling, and your host for Kaleidoscope, a live streaming event that reflects on diverse views on mental health equity. We have some amazing guests with us today who have a lot of passion and compassion in their work and their lives. So please join me in welcoming Shannon Solie, they, them, provides sex-positive therapy through an anti-oppression lens to individuals, couples, and groups. Oblio Stroyman, they, them, has worked as a therapist in the Eugene, Springfield, Oregon community and sits on so many mental health and addictions advisory boards I can't begin to tell you. They are co-founder of TransPonder, which provides transgender diverse resources, and Joshua Wallace, he, him, identifies as a person thriving in long-term recovery from co-occurring challenges and is the CEO and president of Peer Washington. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We have so much to celebrate during Pride Month, and yet there is still much to talk about in mental health inequity and services in the LGBTQIA plus community. And let's talk about that. LGBTQIA plus communities and individuals face up to twice as much abuse or violence. That can be physical, mental, sexual, emotional, than heterosexual counterparts. This kind of prejudice and discrimination adds an extra layer of risk on top of already existing biological, social, environmental, and psychological factors that can lead to some very important health issues, mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, and even suicide. So this is very serious. We don't have all the answers. We're not going to answer many of them in 45 minutes to an hour. We don't speak for everyone in this community. Really important to put that out there up front. We're here to raise awareness and encourage dialogue. So welcome. Let's start with some very basic terms. Can you help us all understand better definitions of what's gender versus sex, what's cisgender versus transgender, and how about this long list of letters we use, LGBTQIA+? Help us understand some of the terminology.
Certainly. Do you want anybody to just jump in, or would you like us to?
This is an open conversation. Just jump in.
Well, I'm happy to jump. I will say that in terms of cisgender, transgender, these are terms that come from roots still holding a binary, which is a piece that I think we need to be looking at as a society, because we still kind of lump people in one of two categories. Cisgender is I identify and feel comfortable within the gender that I was assigned at birth and move through life using those terms. And then everything else gets lumped under transgender. So there's that. So non-binary folks do get lumped under the transgender umbrella, but not all non-binary people identify as trans. So we're going to confuse the language right off the bat. I will jump in on that one, and then I will hand, because I know we all have lots to say on this topic alone.
Yeah, I think kind of simply put, some of the ways that I put it is cisgender is more of a descriptive term rather than an identity. And so somebody who's cisgender means your sex assigned at birth. The doctor says it's a boy, it's a girl, they're intersex, matches your gender identity. So if they say you're a boy, and this is mostly based on genitals, really nothing else at the time, and you identify as a man, then you're cisgender as a descriptor. Anybody else may be trans, but not necessarily. Cis means on this side of, and trans means across from. And so some folks who are trans, whether binarily identified or not, identify with the trans label. Some don't. So it's more of a could be, but isn't necessarily.
Yeah, I love that. And I think for folks who get really sort of offended at, why are you calling me cisgender? Where did this name come from? You know, cis is Latin for same. It's really pretty simplistic, I think, and its clarification in relation to transgender and other I won't go further on that, but I'll speak to gender versus sex. Gender is an identity that someone relates to, versus sex is the actual physical makeup of their body. So, we are accustomed to, if we think about the binary being male and female, and we're accustomed to being assigned your gender role based on your sex, as seen from the visual perspective at birth. And so, really when we think about folks today, there's more ways in which we can express ourselves, or we may identify, or we may find a connection with internally with regards to gender. So, you'll begin to hear things like gender fluid, or maybe identify with female gender, or any number of other types of relationships. And so I think that's important because it's about an expression of someone's self, the way that they feel inside, the way they present who they are. And I think probably the biggest challenge against that is that it fights the sort of patriarchal binary that we are so accustomed to, that has been really ingrained in our brains. And of course, if we identify along that, then we've never had an opportunity to challenge it, and it can become confusing. I'll touch on the LGBTQIA2D. I don't know. To be honest, I can't keep up the letters either. But what I will tell you is two things that I think about that. I think it's a beautiful representation of the growth of our community in understanding itself and advocating for itself. For folks who grew up around the time that I did, being able to attach and come together as these communities really was about, gays coming together, lesbians come together, and transgender, much like they are today, are really pushed back to the backseat. When we think of bisexual, it was always an accusation of not picking a side. Here we are again with that binary. And particularly in those days, you want to think about when the AIDS crisis really hit, a lot of the focus went to gay men. A lot of our lesbian family really pulled together to take support, and it's one of the reasons why we moved the L around. But there was also a piece around that still living the binary and being able to connect to the genders that are identified with those that made a lot of sense. And I think today, what we see is first this promulgation of how do I really identify in terms of my sexuality. So it's not really about being binary. How do I do that? How do I do that in a way that is culturally appropriate? If we think about two-spirit among indigenous communities and what that really means to them and their history. And so I like this ability that people can be really more descriptive about how they identify. But I also want to say that one thing that I find very interesting is that, in my youth, queer was a pejorative. And even today, people my age consider queer. Don't call me queer. I don't want to be called that. That's awful. I identify on the spectrum. But what I see in youth is a desire to identify with queer because the spectrum is very binary. And I think there's a lot of beauty in that. I think that shows a bit of transition. If we want to look at the little bits of progress we've made in spite of all the hate and the fear, I think that's really kind of what it means to me. So to me, I think I want to continue to celebrate that. Each new letter, each new way that our community wants to identify. To me, that's a beautiful exploration.
I would love to jump in there on two quick points. So I also want to just separate out the sex and sexuality are two different terms, and oftentimes sexuality and gender get kind of intermixed because within all of this lettering, we do include people who are heteronormative in their desires towards others, but are trans in their bodies. And so that's the gender piece. And then there's the sexuality piece, which is the being attracted to people of same sex or sexual organs and or gender, right? And that can be any intermixing of those three things. So I also just know that we tend to utilize sex as a misnomer in two different ways, one talking about gender and one talking about sexuality. And it actually doesn't fully encompass all of those things all in one. I also want to throw out, as somebody who identifies as queer, and that is very much my term and my heart term, for me, queer is my full umbrella. It encapsulates my sex, it encapsulates my gender, it encapsulates my sexuality, and it also encapsulates my politic. So that for me is why queer is a really important word for me and the way that I move through the world. I'm a queer human in all the ways that word encompasses. So that for me is, just to give it from somebody who identifies that way.
Yeah, and I think there's one more important distinction just to be made before shifting from definitions, probably, which would be, sex is about biology and lots of different kinds of biology. It could be genitals, DNA, hormones, secondary sex characteristics, all the things. And that in itself is queer. Nature is very queer. It's not binary. So there's a lot of different measures. Gender is a social construct of what it means to be male or female or of another gender in any particular culture. And it varies across cultures, and it's varied even in our own culture and continues to vary. So that's what gender is. So that's socially constructed by the culture you're in. And gender identity is your sense of yourself in relationship to all of that. So I just want to delineate some of those terms. And the LGBTQIA plus, I hear a lot of people say, oh, there's so many letters, I don't know what they are. And that's fine. Pick as far as you can go and put a plus on the end, because the plus lets other people know that you're making room for their identities, because there's a lot of us that aren't listed. I'm pansexual. That isn't listed there. I'm queer too. They all fit together. But I really want to highlight some of what Shannon was saying, is that included in the LGBTQIA plus umbrella is both sexual orientation and gender identity, and those are not the same thing. And even within the community, there's conversations about what that means to all be lumped together. And just like any community of marginalized folks, we're not all going to have the same opinions, the same ways of relating to terms, and we can all be allies. Everybody, hopefully everybody listening and everybody in this group can be an ally, because even though I identify with some of those letters, or have and don't anymore, I still don't embody all of them. So I can be an ally. And so we're going to talk about a lot of things today, definitions and those kinds of things. And it's important to have a common language. But the reality is, you don't know what that means ever until you have a relationship with that person, and a close enough one for them to let you know what it means to them.
Beautiful. Really, really amazing things. Thank you, everyone. In fact, it reminds me that in nature, there are no boxes. Nature is about diversity and the beauty of diversity. Social constructs create boxes. We as human beings create boxes because we're trying to fit things into some sort of order. When we do that, we create barriers. And in mental health, the goal is to do away with those barriers. We often say, meet people where they're at. And I also say, meet people who they are, because it's not just where you are in time and place. You may be feeling certain things as a human being at this point in time, and 2 months or 2 years or 2 decades later, you may be experiencing very different feelings in your life. So let's talk a little bit about the barriers that are created, both access to care overall, and specifically access to care that's sensitive and competent in addressing the needs of LGBTQIA communities, whether that's trust, whether it's safety, whether it's cost, cultural competence. And then we'll take Tana's question as well right after that.
Well, I have a lot to say on this. So, I think the best way for me to sort of explain how I see the impact of being along the spectrum in terms of what it does in your life, and then what it does in terms of not only bringing you to the need and the exposure around behavioral health issues, but also the competent care. From the time that we can understand words, we are hearing microaggressive commentary or invalidations about LGBTQ folks. We hear invalidations about people with addiction disease. We hear invalidations about people with mental health. And they become so ingrained in that early process of our brain development and the way that we view the world that, when the day comes, we realize that is us. I will say, certainly for me, it was like folding every single bit of that ugliness in and owning it. And then oftentimes, I think the reality of how do we come out and be in community and do what we do. The impact on mental health is huge. The need for us to begin meeting in places that are hidden in darker parks or bars that are always sort of built around substance use of some form or fashion or another. Our culture, our community because of the hatred that we face, puts us in a position to not only feel these pressures, but to find coping mechanisms that are not healthy. So it should not be a huge surprise to anybody that the LGBTQ community as a whole are 4 times more likely to be impacted by mental health, by addiction, or to attempt suicide than our heteronormative counterparts. But that's as a whole. And even when I talk about that, we're not really taking a look at the intersectionalities that exist within our community. What about Black trans woman, for example, is got probably some of the most impactful intersections of disparity. And so not only is the implication upon them of the stress and the hate and the fear that's going to compound their mental health, their requirements to survive, the fear, but when they need to go receive services, where do they get them that's competent? And they don't. They just simply don't. And even in some of the best intentioned places, they don't. And I will share this with you. And again, my personal experience, for those who know, I lost my wife last year to behavioral health and to hate is really how I put it. And she was a trans woman, a white trans woman, but getting her into services that are even supposed to be competent. We have gay programming, for example. What they would do is they would just make all of those folks attend a meeting together, and that was considered competency. And despite the competency, the hatred still existed. And so again, there was no room for safe service. And she was a very privileged individual. So this is not representative of our community as a whole. So there's nothing there. And when we create something like our organization exists to create safe space for LGBTQ, it exists because we don't have it anywhere else. And one of the things that we have found interesting over the years, and then I'll wrap it up, is that we began to see people who were not LGBTQ identified coming to receive services. And we don't turn anybody away, but we have always been accustomed to people self-selecting out. But the world has changed, and the feeling that they could come there, I think had lessened. And so what we began to find is the discomfort for our folks was increasing again, because here they were in a place where folks can have those microaggressions and walk out the door and be fine, and they were having to deal with it. And so, I think it says a lot about, the parts of our community that don't live the privileges like I do of being a white male who is cisgender, and generally, I don't present too far off of the heteronormative mark, right? So, what does that do when they go down the line? What are we doing to actually create this competency? Today we're an organization that is LGBTQ and we have straight programming. And, for those of us in the community, it's like, okay, that's real. But what happens for all those areas that don't? I can talk forever.
Yeah, well, I'd like to address the idea of competency for a moment. And Maureen has been in some of my sessions, and one of the things I will say is, even if the CEUs say we're going for competency, cultural competency, I will never call what I'm offering competency, because there is no competency. There is only awareness, and then you working with individuals. So when we talk about organizations, mental health organizations, SUDS organizations, building competency, here are some of the things I would recommend. And one of them is having people at the table who are most impacted by the services that you're hoping to create. So rather than having me have an idea of what I think I need to do, or what some academic has waxed philosophical about what people need, I want to get people from that community in to tell me and help me evaluate my intake practices, my paperwork, the kinds of assessments that I'm doing. And that's across intersecting marginalized identities. So it's not just for LGBTQIA plus folks. And again, as I said before, when we're talking about LGBTQIA plus folks, if you only have someone who's L come in and evaluate, you may be missing a lot of other things. So making sure you have supervisors on hand, that represent diverse backgrounds. And it sounds challenging, but it's actually less challenging than you might think. You just got to start looking for it. So that's how I like organizations to start to be ready to receive folks, and having being connected to those referral sources if it's beyond the scope of your practice.
And systemically making a space where folks of all different intersections feel comfortable and cared for within your organization as well. So bringing people in just to be the voice of blank can also be pretty damaging if your organization is not taking care of those folks by learning and growing and being more mindful. I am like just aware of time and there's a lot of questions to cover. So I'm going to actually just throw like resource for like jumping off points for clinicians or folks who are working in this. I will say a starting point is looking at the minority stress model. That just is a great breakdown. And then basically with that, right, if you have one minority stress and then you have another and another and another and another, you can just see where this stacks very quickly. And it's a great visual that you can just kind of easily pop up, look at. It's a flow chart and you're just like, oh, wow, yep, stress. So that's one resource. It's very accessible. You can kind of Google it, it pops right up. And then my brain lost the other one because I am 3 weeks out from COVID, and this has been a really fun COVID experience. Is I just lose stuff, so I'm going to move off that.
Well, it's great that you said that, Shannon, because we will have additional resources on our website, so that's wonderful, and we hope that not only all of you who are with us today as our guests, but those in the audience will share resources with us as well. I do want to go back just real quickly because Tana's comment was so beautiful. She said, after only 10 minutes, you're already explaining these things so clearly and authentically and in a way that makes sense. Thank you so much. So I think that's really important. Every time each of you speaks, 12 more questions comes into my head. But one of them in particular, Joshua, you talked about intersectionality. All of you did in certain ways. Let's talk a little bit specifically about how service providers, whether they're treatment providers, whether they're recovery services, whether they're primary care services, what do they need to check at the door around their biases, around privilege, around respecting by using proper terminology, by making sure you're not addressing your clients by a dead name or using incorrect pronouns, those sorts of things. What would you say to our service providers?
I love this one. I'm going to jump in. A few things is like, I mean, just check yourself before you wreck yourself, right? Like that should be a general rule anytime we walk into a room with another human being is like, where am I at and what am I carrying right now? And can I put it down? Right? So if your organization has the ability to do this, have somewhere in your charts, in your notes, this is this person's name and pronouns. It's not always going to be what's on the particular forms because insurance has one thing they need and billing has another, right? Like there's all these different needs that actually do require that sometimes you do dead name or misgender a human being because because the legal paperwork has not been changed yet, right? But that is no reason why you can't meet the human in front of you as the human in front of you. Put a Post-it note inside the chart if that's what it takes that just says this is this person's name and pronouns. It's a really simple way to take care. Another thing you can do is introduce using your own. Hi, I'm Shannon. I use they, them pronouns. What's your name? What's your pronouns? How do I respect you? Another just like key thing is we kind of talked about this when the definitions come up. Somebody comes in, sits down and says, I identify as queer. How does that work for you? Great. Can you tell me what queer means for you? What does lesbian mean for you? What do you want me to know as your provider, right? Regardless of what I'm providing, what's important for me to know so that I'm respecting you in that realm? Okay, that's my soapbox.
Anybody else want to jump in there? Oblio, I know you are particularly interested in privilege and intersectionality. Anything you want to add to that discussion?
Many things, but for brevity's sake, I mean, a lot of what Shannon said, look for the yes and rather than the yeah but. So if your electronic records are an issue in putting someone's names go by and pronouns, not preferred pronouns, because they're just somebody's pronouns, find a way around it. And if you need help, reach out because a lot of us have found ways around it. I wish we could put sticky notes on charts, but we don't have paper charts that much anymore. And there are some things that you have in your infrastructure that may not work. Like, let's say you only have binary bathrooms. Talk to people about the bathroom policies. And if you can't change that, say, I know this stinks and this is what we have. How can I make this better for you? Those kinds of things, so being aware of the stressors, and we don't have time. I have so many things I could talk about that are stressors for somebody walking through the door and what they might experience. But be aware of those stressors and then empathize and try and work as allies to change them. Talking about intersectionality, I really like what Shannon shared about the stress test. There is not one that trumps another. They just kind of compound. So asking folks what's important for you to know about them culturally, about their sexual orientation, their gender identity, about their background, that we should all be doing that in good assessments, but also informing ourselves about how that may impact somebody. We can do all that reading, or we can connect with people and talk about that, but not allowing the person to come to therapy with what is most true for them. Because what I see a lot of providers do is they're like, oh, you have anxiety and depression, it must be because you're trans. No, not necessarily. So making sure you're meeting the person where they're at with what they're bringing forward, while being informed that maybe experiencing a lot of microaggressions every day could also be exacerbating that. And I think it's also really important to normalize what people might be turning to for coping mechanisms, as we see in gambling or SUDS treatment. A lot of people might want to check out from a lot of really intense circumstances, and normalizing that. And I think it's important. A lot of people reach out to my organization during Pride Month, and Pride Month only. And they're like, you're like, we want to be your ally. I'm like, okay, let's do this all year round. But there's this other piece. When we talk about intersectionality, you can't talk about Pride. I don't know why Pride and Juneteenth have been such separate things for so long, because the liberation of the LGBTQIA plus movement stands on the back of the civil rights movement carried forward by Black folks. So we can't really talk about them separately. And the folks who started, for whom we're commemorating Pride, were a lot of Black, gender nonconforming women, working girls, lots of different folks that we tend to put over here in the margins. So we can't talk about Pride with talking about that it's a fight and a celebration. And so anytime we're working with LGBTQIA plus folks in our offices, we have to understand, we have to step into a place of being willing to fight with them and understand that struggle, but also making a lot of room for the celebration and holding both in the work that we're doing together.
Absolutely. I was going to add to that. I really like Oblio's idea of having a diverse advisory committee of folks, but I also think a diversity in those that you employ is important. I think at the end of the day, I want to go where I see folks like me through the window. And so while we're never going to be able to have, some full, understanding of anybody that walks through the door, because it's all individual, I think, a big part of being able to begin to serve intersectionality is to make sure that we're representing it in our workforce, right? And bringing that to bear, I think, would make a huge difference. So
I just want to jump in on that real quick, because I love what Joshua is saying. And I want to also add, yes, have diversity in your workforce, but be ready to support them. Do the work it takes to be able to, for once you hire folks, that you're able to retain them so that they're supported. So saying that, I want to hire diversity, which is hard to hire anybody nowadays. We're all having a workforce struggle. And then we have this idea of having diversity, which I am all about. But what is your organization doing to support them if they're the only trans person on your staff or the only Black person on your staff? Like, what are you doing to make sure that the culture itself doesn't traumatize your workforce? So it's a multi-layered process.
Thank you. As you were talking, it reminded me of past, present, and even discussions we were having earlier about future and what's coming up. But stressors, whether they are emotional stressors, whether they're mental health stressors, whether they are trauma in many cases that is from childhood on, can be from any sources. Oblio's right. It's not always because of your gender orientation or anything. There are lots of things to look at. And so we also need to look at some of the ways people deal with those individually, even before they start to get help. Some of that may be self-medicating with alcohol or substance use or gambling. And I'd really like to get your input on how we can, as treatment and recovery service supporters, better focus on the role substance use and gambling might play in a person's life, both in a negative role and in a supportive role. Because I've heard from folks that they got into alcohol use because the only safe place for them to go was a gay bar at one point in their life. And drinking was part of the social atmosphere and it got out of control. So talk a little bit to me about alcohol, substance use, gambling, and what role that plays in the LGBTQIA community.
I will be quick because I know that I think you two, Oblio, and I mean, y'all work a lot more than I do in this department, but I genuinely have the belief system that like life is a series of coping mechanisms, and some of them are adaptive and some of them are maladaptive. And they only become maladaptive if they are becoming harmful and if they are no longer serving their purpose of like helping you move through the world in a safer way, right? And yes, some of them have a higher risk involved to them, but we all are doing coping mechanisms. I worked out this morning and I spent 2 hours in my yard this morning. Those are coping mechanisms. So it's just about what are we choosing? And alcohol is a large one. It is where community lives still to this day. It is where a lot of queer community happens. And I grew up in Reno, Nevada. Like I know gambling, you know, and honestly, gambling was not how I escaped my microaggressions and macroaggressions as a young person, but alcohol and substance was, because it was what was accessible. So that's kind of my place in it, is like, we're all working with coping mechanisms, and that is why none of them are just inherently bad. They become maladaptive when they are no longer serving, you know, and actually tip the scales into harm.
I think Shannon pretty much just said it all. That was perfect. Beautiful and succinct. But one of the things we keep throwing around this term microaggression, and I don't even know if people know what that term means. So I just want to define that real quick, because all three of us have done so. And even within the community itself, folks are challenging that word microaggression. We don't have a different one yet, because how can any aggression be micro is what the conversation now is. But essentially what we're talking about is somebody saying or doing something that makes somebody, mostly of a marginalized community, feel unsafe. And it's usually unintentional, but it's still true, as opposed to an aggression like a slur or a act of violence on somebody. You know, privilege has become a dirty word in our culture, and I just want to say, let's get over that and say privilege simply means that there are obstacles that you don't face that somebody else does, and we often don't know that is a thing until somebody informs us. And oftentimes when somebody informs us, we get defensive or angry. So it's just something to understand. That's what privilege means. And oftentimes a microaggression will come from that place of privilege. Like, I don't understand that you face an obstacle, so I say something ignorant about that, and that's something that stings. And then and some of us get those a lot more than others over the course of a day. So finally, if you're the 50th person that day who's misgendered me and I blow up at you, you may not understand why you're getting such an intense reaction. You're like, how was I supposed to know you use they them pronouns? But that's why. That's why there's so much intensity around a particular reaction. I want to offer a quick tool, and I'll be quick because it's really important. If somebody tells you that you've stepped on their toes with a microaggression, doesn't matter what your intention was, your impact was painful. And especially if you hold a place of privilege, like if you're cisgender, if you're heterosexual, if you're white, any of these things. So if somebody tells you, it takes so much chutzpah to tell you. So say thank you and say, what can I do for you right now? Rather than, I didn't mean it. Why are you so sensitive? You know, you have an opportunity to show up in a place of healing in that moment rather than continuing centuries of oppression and pain. So if that's the one tool you take away from today, I hope you can understand that's what's happening. And that's what we mean when we say microaggression.
Joshua, I think you're muted.
people would pay for that. I want to build. Sorry, I want to build on what's been said here because I just think this is super important. Obviously, it's a big part of what I do. But first of all, the way this has been framed has been great. I think we just, first of all, step back and stop thinking about addiction in the terms that we normally do. You know, we want to assign it to things that are illegal or things that are particularly stigmatized, or we want to say, you know, if you do this, then you must be an addict, or if you're an addict of this, you must be an addict of everything. So we have to stop all of this box putting to begin with. And when we step back in and we want to look at our community and why these impacts happen, they're really for two major reasons in my mind. You know, one of them is just the mere fact of the trauma and the mental health component of being the focus of these macro, let's just call them what they are, mistreatments, invalidations, however you want to look at it. You know, it causes us to have an imbalance in the brain. We get depression, we get fear, we get anxiety. Now, does that mean that is this a serious mental illness situation? No, it's not at all. But, you know, when we talk about addictive behaviors, whether they're substance, legal or illegal, or whether they're behavioral, they all do something to lift those levels back up in the brain to make you feel good. And of course, we want to feel good, right? And so whether that's a problem or not is something else entirely. But you can imagine in our community with the layer of oppression that occurs, that those tend to come forward more. But I think the second piece is, you know, really is about how we, not just in how we meet each other and where we are sort of been relegated to have our social interactions. But I think there's also when we go back to, you know, I was talking about earlier, those invalidations that we've heard that we sort of own, in that, you know, a male identified person shouldn't be having sex with a male identified person. And when the time comes for that to happen, the shame is there, the lack of knowledge, even in terms of the way we see things portrayed in movies. And so I'll tell you, you know, being drunk, for example, sort of lowers those inhibitions. Having chemical or chemsex, as we call it, but if you're going to take, like, say, methamphetamine to heighten the moment, to relieve or remove those burdens or those blocks to engagement, they then become sort of part and parcel to our ability to express ourselves in physical ways. And that's a huge problem, right? Because here it comes from that piece of oppression. And so, you know, I think understanding that and being able to address folks when they come in and what component they're really dealing with is super important. And to really, you know, to be free from having that stigma would be amazing, but it doesn't exist. So owning that there's stigma coming from multiple different directions when we look at these, I think it's a great way for folks who are going to be helping folks in our community address these be a lot more impactful.
Yes, stigma is plays such an important role in everything when we're dealing with any kind of mental health issues. It would be absolutely marvelous, and I think all of us here look for a perfect future, if it's ever possible, where we're all striving to better understand the person across from us, the person next to us, the person we want to serve. Joshua, you said something earlier about how important it is to be able to look in and see somebody who looks like me, and wanting to feel safe, particularly important when we're talking about mental health treatment, when we're talking about any kind of healthcare treatment. Can you all talk a little bit about how important it is to have people not only who look like us, but who have lived experience like us when we're dealing with emotional stressors and ways of medicating those ourselves and dealing with them, whether it be the mental health provider themselves, whether it be a recovery support, and Joshua, your whole list of peer there, I think, tells people that that's important to you. So talk to me a little bit about lived experience and support services.
Well, I'm happy to kick this off because this is my passion to no end, obviously, as you can tell. But I'll take peer services as one of those things that why it's still confusing today is beyond me. Peer emotional support goes back to the beginning of humankind. And we have all these sayings like, until you've walked a mile in my shoes and all this sort of stuff. But let me tell you, the reality is that, you know, there's two things going on. I think let's talk about, you know, mental health as an example. It's already stigmatized. It's stigmatized to talk about it and to have it. And then, you know, mental health, many components of mental health are oftentimes the brain's protective responses to trauma and other things. And so the way that it makes us act is different than the expected norm, right? Which is why we call it behavioral health. Oh, not a great term, frankly. But here's the truth of it, right? If I'm going to be talking to somebody about the issues that come up for me in my daily life as a person who lives with complex PTSD, and that's very true for me, there are certain components to it that are just embarrassing to tell people, and I don't want to. And when I don't talk about them and I can't be free and open about them, then I can't address them, right? If the person who is sitting across from me doesn't understand it, or doesn't, isn't able to take it in, or sits there quietly, sometimes that sort of reinforces that I'm the only one. But not everybody understands that when I'm in a restaurant or something, I need my back to the wall because I need to know that I'm safe back here, that that's covered. Because as a person with PTSD, I look around. I've got to talk with somebody about this, right? And this is just an example. And whether that is a clinician with a power differential, right, who needs to be able to understand and address that in a way that's meaningful, or whether it is that I'm sitting across from a peer who can at least share with me that they've had the similar experiences, I no longer feel alone and can begin to work on it. Without those components in place, they continue to be a part of the sickness that we're trying to address that don't come forward. And we're not going to bring forward those pieces if it's not safe. And if we don't bring forward those pieces, we're never really going to be able to get to a better place of being. So, that understanding component is super important. I don't think that every single person has to be that way, and you're never going to have the same shared experience as another person. But being able to match that shared experience component with the professional treatment and interventions that exist out there that may work for someone, I think that's the way that we really bring somebody into the fold of trust, that we really be able to illuminate everything that's going on so that it can be addressed as the person needs, as the person sees fit. Without that, I think that we're going to be lacking in our service to folks.
So for me, this comes to like insider outsider pieces. There's a sharedness in the insider language of like, having a queer therapist as a queer individual, or having a gay man as a therapist as a gay man in the world. And there's kind of a like, you know what I mean? And you can use some of the language and things like that, right? You don't have to like define everything. Like we had to do this in here, right? There's a little bit of that, granted, not always, and it's always good to check, right? So there's like clinician wise, it's important to keep in mind your clients may need to have some identity with you. And so self-disclosure may actually be beneficial in some situations. Also, though, I'm going to say clinically, that's where some clinicians can get in trouble, where they're like, oh, yeah, I totally know that experience. I got you. And that's actually where we can do some ethical breaches that are not actually good for our clients. So like clinician wise, it's important to keep in mind that disclosure is good, but also assuming that sharedness is so shared can actually be detrimental to your clients. So kind of holding that both and is really important. Yeah, that's what I want to add.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to talk about this concept of looks like me, because to some people I look like a white man or a white gay man. And those are none of my identities. So for me, it's less about does somebody look like me, although it might be particularly important for folks of color, let me just say, but it's more so important to how we build rapport and connect. Because there's, as I say, LGBTQIA plus is huge umbrella. And, I'm a polyamorous person. Are they somebody who is all about marriage? There's a lot of different things that are different diversity factors within the community. And my sexuality and my gender identity is just two little facets of this big, huge composite of who I am. So it is not necessarily important that they share that identity. What is important is that I don't have to teach them all about it and catch them up to speed, just so that we can even start to have a conversation. And I know some folks who do share identities with me who I absolutely would not want to have as a therapist. That rapport would not be happening. So So I think it's more nuanced than the question allows, because we're such a composite of different things. And what am I actually going in for? Is it more important to me that person have LGBTQIA plus identity, or is it more important to this person really understands PTSD? And maybe that's their specialty, and maybe they have a lived experience in that. And they've done a lot of self work and study around LGBTQIA plus identity, so I don't have to be the person educating them. I think it does get tricky in therapy, and here's kind of my rule of thumb, which is it is never the marginalized person's job to educate us about being that marginalized person. However, in therapy, you're not going to know stuff about people unless you talk to them and ask them about themselves. So the rule of thumb I tend to put out there is, why am I asking that question? Am I asking that question to build rapport and understand this individual better? Or am I asking this question because I want to understand a generalization and or have some sort of like tickle excitement curiosity about what it would be like to be that kind of person? And if that's the case, maybe go to Google. But if you're really wanting to build that rapport, then it's probably a good question to ask, because you do need to ask people questions about what it means to them. Like Shannon said earlier, okay, you're queer. What does that mean for you? What do your relationships look like? And finding ways to ask those open-ended questions, because I know somebody who wrote a book, I think it was called Bad Dyke, because she identifies as a lesbian and she's married to a man. And so what does it mean to her to be a lesbian? And you would only know by asking. So it was not make assumptions about what those things mean, and leave things as open-ended as we can.
Yeah, thank you for that, and too, because I guess I wasn't even necessarily thinking as a visual, but I love that. But I only know for myself, and even as a privileged gay white man, when I was looking for therapy, what I was really looking for is I was looking for a therapeutic, and I was looking on the web. I was looking for a therapeutic provider that really, not only was directed to our community, but sort of had that. And I kind of wonder, like if you think about, and I'd be curious to know too, from your perspective, how would you know when you look in? Is it the way that they frame themselves in the window? Like, do they have the right flags up? Are they inclusive there on the web? How do you think people could best really see, whether literally visual or not, that this might be a safe place for them?
Well, for me, it is having visuals, but also a narrative to back it up. I'm not interested in places who just, yes, put a flag on your website, and yes, put the most inclusive flag up on your website, and sure, have a statement, and let me know some bullet points of what you're doing to be able to back that up. A lot of people, Black Lives Matter existed before George Floyd was murdered. And a lot of people got really behind the cause and put up these statements of purpose, but they, again, nothing to back it up. And so don't misrepresent yourself. Share what you're actually doing, and you don't have to have it all down, but share what you're doing to get that education. And those visual representations really do matter. And I'll even say, I was looking for a doctor up at OHSU for something, and it was something unrelated to being trans. And I was reading everybody's bio to see who mentioned that they work with trans and gender diverse people, because when you educate yourself in that way and care enough to put it out there, that tells me that we've at least jumped a couple of the hurdles, and then we'll find out if we have the rapport. But making sure you put it forward.
Yeah,
I love that. Thank you.
I want to jump in on a couple of things there. I love the question, and I also ask it, who is this for? So when, like, why am I speaking? Who is this for? Why am I asking this question? So I'm going to just throw out a wonderful resource for folks. It's called The Wheel of Consent, playing the 3-minute game. Betty Martin, she's a badass. I worship her. But you can wheelofconsent.com or bettymartin.org. It's a wonderful, wonderful quick resource. She has tons of YouTube videos breaking down kind of this concept. And it's also really, really useful to offer to clients to also utilize within their relationships. I put it out there on my website. I have on my website, I identify as a white, queer, poly human being who is trained in these ways. I'm the parent of an adult child. I love my dog more than anything in the world, and you will see her in our sessions. It's like, I'm going to be kind of honest. Here's who I am, and here is the work that I do. And I also want to put out there, don't don't falsify, right? Like, it's okay if you're not doing the work. I mean, I would prefer you do the work. But if you are not in a place to do the work, if you're not in a place to learn the histories and everything else, I mean, yeah, it's Pride Month. Pride Month has a history. It's not just about a parade that a bunch of corporations are marching in. It is a history. So, like, if you are not in a place to do that education, that is okay, but don't advertise yourself as such. Stick with what you know. There are plenty of people out there who need assistance and supports. So let the people who can hold the people do the work, and you hold your folks. Like, I work in the cancer industry. We need a lot of people in the cancer industry, and we need people that have that intersection of cancer and queer culture. So I'm like, it's okay if you aren't there, but don't falsify it and don't put it on your website if you're not, because that's where harm happens.
Really powerful. I love that. And in fact, I have a lot more questions. Obviously, we're not going to get to all of them, but I did want to just share that I've known Oblio and I've known Joshua for some time. I haven't known Shannon for very long, about a week or 2 weeks. And when we first connected, she put me to the test. She interviewed me. She asked me, what's your philosophy? How do you back it up? Where do you come from? And I'm so pleased to have you here with us, all of you, for keeping us honest, for making me do the work, for hopefully this is a positive forum today, that we will have you back many, many times in many different ways, and other people as well. So rather than asking the rest of my questions to close out this session, I would like to ask each of you, I may not have asked all the right questions, but what are the top 2 or 3 things that each of you would like to make sure that people watching this and interacting with this and engaging with this take away from them, and what are their next steps? So whoever would like to start.
Well, okay, I'm going to go first. And so in my own mind, I can think of the great diversity of folks who could be watching here. So I don't know that I have any one bit of wisdom to take with anyone, other than to say, I think that we can all do a lot better if we celebrate and accept the diversity and differences in everyone, that we don't have to agree with or be in alignment with or to live like other people, to accept that. And that I will say for me, if you are encountering other cultures, communities, folks that are immediately bringing up negative emotions in yourself, take some time to ask yourself what that's about somewhere else. There's just no need for us to spread this sort of stuff with one another. And I think that if that's not just with other people, but it's also with ourselves, because I can tell you, just as a gay man, I have a lot of that pointed inwards, and I have to do a lot of that. So I hope that that's what folks can walk away with at the very least, and sort of maybe take that lens, that new lens, and look at the folks that you engage with on a day-to-day basis.
I mean, a couple of the things I hope people take home. I mean, one big word is humility. And so you will never know everything. You don't know what you don't know. And sometimes when we find out what that is, we can feel bad about ourselves, or we're a bad person, or we did it wrong. I'm just going to invite you, much like a little kid, to be like, oh, okay. And, and take it in and start to learn to do it better. When you learn, it's not a matter of if you're going to step on somebody's toes, it's when. And so when that happens, show up in solidarity by saying, thank you for letting me know. You don't need to over explain yourself, and just try to hold it and move forward. Educate yourself and make connections. The basis of any work that we're doing in diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging work, any of it, is building relationships. It's not us and them. It's not a hypothetical group of folks. It's like, who am I looking at right now in their eyes? So get involved with local groups and support them. and then you'll meet people, so it's not a token friend. You're actually giving your energy and meeting people. You're educating yourself by educators who are actually of the population, who know what they're talking about. That is where lived experience is really important. Your educators can't just be people who are academics writing papers about people. They have to be of the people, in my opinion. And give yourself some grace and be humble when people let you know an oops and an ouch.
Curiosity is one of my favorite words on the planet. I wish curiosity for all folks. I wish all of us could go back to beginner brain and remember what it's like to explore this world as young people experiencing it for the first time in our lives, right? We just have so much curiosity, and it gets kind of boomed out of us through so many different parts of life. But go back, genuine curiosity, expose yourself. A great place to start so that those ouchies aren't happening at such an extreme pace is, like, if you have Netflix, there are so many TV shows on Netflix that start and talk about and expose you to so many of these conversations. Same with Hulu, same with YouTube, right? Like, there is so much of this that can expose you before you accidentally step on someone's toes. So expose yourself and just see, well, maybe don't expose yourself, but expose yourself to things and just see what kinds of things pop into your world, right? And just be super curious. It is so much fun to really genuinely experience curiosity all over again. So that's what I hope people leave with.
I just love this conversation today with all of you. You are such brilliant, bright, shining people. Thank you for the work you do, for the people that you support and help. Thank you for letting me share some time with you. I couldn't agree more that letting go, particularly letting go of the fear and letting yourself immerse in something that perhaps you never thought you would before, because otherwise you lose so much. Life is about experiencing everything we can, learning everything we can, and touching everybody we can. So to me, this is a way to do that. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Tana, for sharing how much you've learned. Other people are sharing great comments. I wish you all well, and I look forward to our next conversation in the future. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.